Geraldine Jamieson on Manx Radio.
Hello and a very warm welcome indeed to this week's programme. Now, my guest today taught in a range of schools for 14 years before becoming an education advisor and, most importantly, school inspector. He is now a freelance lecturer, writer, very popular broadcaster, consultant for the Open University, Professor of Education at the University of Teesside and Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. But is probably best known for his two best-selling autobiographical novels, The Other Side of the Dale and Over Hill and Dale, published by Michael Joseph, which he read on Radio 4 Book of the Week. But undoubtedly one of the most accomplished speakers of any kind, a natural storyteller and born raconteur, it is with enormous pleasure that I welcome Gervais Phinn onto the Geraldine Jamieson interview for the second time around. Nice to have you with us again here on the island, Gervais.
Gosh, Geraldine, what an introduction. I can't wait to hear what I'm about to say now. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction.
Well, this time, actually, you were invited over here as guest speaker at the festival luncheon of the Isle of Man Arts Council Annual Literature Festival. And as well as that, I'm sure, Gervais, that you've been blessed with continuing success since our meeting last December here on the Isle of Man. I mean, in fact, you've had another huge bestseller, and a really mean bestseller, where you were, 1 and 2 overall in Britain bestseller with your latest, another autobiographical novel, Head Over Heels in the Dales. How's it going?
Yeah, well, I mean, that was amazing. I mean, it became #1. I mean, fortunately, Edwina Curry wasn't in the bestseller list then. Otherwise, I suppose that would become... But no, it was great.
She's just a passing phase.
Well, I don't know, but I mean, it was amazing. And of course, I was taken aback with that. So it's been great, yes.
Yeah. And just to set the scene for listeners that may not be, too just au fait with probably what set you on the overall road to fame was when your first appearance on the Esther Rantzen show. Esther asked you on, and you actually have done 3 shows due to public demand.
Well, I was doing a charity talk in for Childline, and Esther Rantzen just appeared. And then said, will you come on my show? And I always thought, well, media people. But I did go on. And yes, I went on 3 times. And then of course it snowballed, because I went on sort of Gloria Hunniford and various other shows. And I've just been on the Des O'Connor show, which was funny. A very amusing experience. But so, and radio and television does have a massive impact on sales of books. It's not false modesty. I mean, the books aren't of any depth and profundity. They're just light-hearted, amusing accounts of me going round as a school inspector meeting small children, and the things they say. I mean, one little girl in York said to me once as I passed a desk, she said, have you ever thought that when I'm 21 you'll probably be dead? Or a little boy I once said to him, your writing's lovely at the top of the page. And he said, I know. I said, but it goes all squiggly at the bottom. He said, I know. He said, this pen's got a life of its own. And what I've done over the years is just jot down these little gems, and they've emerged in this sort of autobiographies.
Well, that's all very well, of course, to be able to write is one tremendous asset to one, of course, but to perform as you perform with almost the timing, of an out-and-out professional comedian.
Yes, well, that's kind of you to say that. I think I was brought up in... my parents had great sense of humour. I mean, they would have to have a sense of humour, calling a little boy who was born in a council house in Rotherham, Gervais.
There's a yoghurt, isn't there, called Gervais?
Well, there is. I mean, there's a French yoghurt called Gervais, yes. I mean, it was in a school where the French assistant, said it is a French name, and everywhere you go you will hear the name Gervais. And it sounded very sexy. I mean, it's the name of a yoghurt. But you see, I was always brought up in a home with massive amounts of storytelling and books and reading. It was a humble background, and people think, the name Gervais, it sounds rather posh. And of course, at school I was bullied because of the strange name, but I love it now. It's a rather nice Right, nice name for a writer, I think.
One of the first steps in your young life, it was very important, was a little tin badge you were awarded at
Yes,
school.
yes. I mean, I went back 18 years ago, Geraldine, to my old infant school to inspect it, and the smell had lingered. But also, my teacher had lingered. She
Miss
was still there.
Greenhalgh.
Miss Greenhalgh, and she was, by that time, near retirement. And, of course, the inspector, I go in, and she's looking there, and she said, "Oh," she said, "Gervais, it's you." And I said, and I just was sort of dumbfounded. I said, "Oh, it's Miss Greenhalgh." I said, "I can't believe it." She said, "My goodness," she said, "you did well, didn't you?" And I said, well, "It's lovely to see you." And she said, "Is it?" I said, "Well, of course." I said, "You were a wonderful teacher." There's a lovely pause, and she said, "Well, it's just as well you said that, Gervais, because I haven't changed my methods." And then she said, "You have got more degrees than a thermometer," she said. "And look where you've ended up, all these books." And then I smiled sort of coyishly. She said, "Because you weren't on the top table, were you?" And she'd remembered all the way back. Now, I wasn't on the top table. And I was an average child. And at the we learned to read from a book called The Happy Trio. I have a good memory for these things. She gave me the book. And it's along the lines of the first story is come, 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 Sally, come, Sally, come, Sally, come. And I moved then on to the real books. And she called me out and pinned on my little jumper the tin badge that said, "I am a free reader." It was like the Victoria Cross for me, because I'd go home along that council estate hoping people would say, "Oh, what?" But they didn't. But when I got home, I covered it over with my hands, and my mother in the kitchen said, "What's that you've got covered up there?" And I took my hands away, and she said, "Oh, where did you find that?" And I said, No, I'm a free reader, Mum." And she kept this up all the day, and my father came in, excuse me, and said, she said, "Jimmy," she said, "he tells me he's a free reader." And Dad came in, and he said, "Well, if you're a free reader, you're going to have to read a book." And I did. It was years later that I was invited to speak actually at Guildhall in London, and I was going down to London. It was a very prestigious affair, gold-edged invitation, and it said decorations will be worn, and I was next to a very important man with his medals and his awards. And next to him, my other side was a woman again with the CBE and Dame of the British Empire, and they were all bemedalled. And even the man who introduced me with a red coat was a papal knight. So they all, and of course, the Sir John, the man on my right, said to me, he said, "What is that very unusual sort of lapel badge that you're wearing?" And I said, "Well, actually, it says I am a free reader." That's the only award I've got, but I'm still very proud of it.
Puts the whole thing in perspective, doesn't it? Puts life in perspective, really.
Well, it does, because you see, I mean, sometimes when I inspect schools, my colleague said, "Oh, what's the point of giving these children these silly little stickers that says, 'I've been a good boy,' or 'well done'?" But they are very important, those, for children, to have a little badge like that. And I do think that, I mean, I was yesterday at the luncheon next to Barbara Gale, who had won the Cleveland Medal for singing, you know, a gold medal. And
Not just one.
Won 4, hasn't she? Yes.
Yes.
And, you know, she wore it for the event yesterday, and she's quite rightly, to have achieved that is marvellous. And I think even when you're little, you thrive on that. And I've always thought as a teacher that children thrive on success and building up the self-esteem. And I had that, Geraldine, as a child, you see.
Yeah. Now, you're actually a South Yorkshireman.
Yes.
But indeed, you write really about North Yorkshire.
Yes, I do.
There's a big difference there.
Massive. And I mean, I was interested when I visited schools on the island, the children's, they were teaching me a little bit of Manx, and I watched some wonderful Manx, traditional dancing. And even, I suppose, on this island, there will be a slight difference in accents between Peel and Castletown or whatever. But in Yorkshire, it's a vast county, there's a strong difference. And when I was an inspector in the Dales, of course, an inspector usually asks pseudo questions. They say to children, "Well, how do you spell this? How do you spell that?" But in the Dales, they were real questions, because I didn't know the answers. And I'd say to a little boy, well, I remember once there was a field, and there were these sheep in the field with different coloured splashes of paint on the back. And I said to this little boy, who was only about 7, "Why are the sheep different colours then?" He said, "Oh, you know." I said, I don't know. He said, you do, you know. I said, I really don't know. He said, of course you do. I said, no, I do not know. He said, well, they ruddled. I said, that doesn't help me. He said, well, in Coverdale, we call it ruddled. In Wensleydale, it's raddled. I said, that still doesn't help me. So, like a very sensitive teacher, this little lad said, well, go on, have a guess then. Have a guess why they're different colours. I said, well, is one red because the shepherds, he knows who his sheep, which his sheep are, the red ones, the green ones, and the other little children laughed. No, they ruddled. He said, in that field, he said, there's one tup and the rest are yows. And then I looked. He said, one ram, a male sheep, and the rest are ewes, female sheep, yes? He says, and you put your ram in, he says, when they're ready for him. He says, and they put underneath in the farmer an harness made of leather with a different coloured wax crane in a big oily crane, and you know where he's been. So if she's got yellow on her back, she's going to lamb early. If she's blue, she's going to lamb a bit later, then green, and last of all is red, and you know the yow's going to lamb late. Because he's seen to her later on, you see. I said, well, very embarrassed. I said, well, shall we look at your books now? And he said, no, let me finish. He says, and then, of course, he says, if she ain't got any colour on her back at all, he said, she ain't been seen to, and he needs a bit of encouraging. So, anyway, I left this, and he came back to me at the end of the day, and little lad looking out over the dale, and I went up to him, and I said, well, thank you very much for telling me that. I said, that's really interesting. And we looked out over the dale, and he said, Mr. Phinn, he said, when I grow up, he says, I'm going to have my own flock. I said, oh, yeah. He said, and I'm going to have my own farmhouse. He said, and I'm going to have, my own farm. He said, and I'm going to get married, I know, as well. I said, oh, yeah. And there's a lovely pause. And he said, but I don't know what colour I'm going to be. The children are amazing to listen to. I just love the company of youngsters, yeah.
Are you looking at it perhaps from a more serious angle, just briefly, Gervais? Are you a little saddened, as to the turn of events, really, bullying in school, if we just take that, the topical thing at the moment of that poor teacher who received death threats from two, really unruly, obviously wicked children that the parents don't seem to be controlling?
I think you put your finger on it there, in that... You see, it's an old chestnut, Geraldine, but when I was at school, my father's a steel worker, and he was very strict with us in many ways, but loving man. Never raised his hand to us, but we never disobeyed Dad. If I'd have gone home and said I was in trouble at school, Dad, I would have been twice as much trouble at home. But I'm afraid in society now you get the parent who will support the child. Now, for my view, for two boys to threaten to stab a teacher, it's illegal. They could be prosecuted for making death threats over a number of, from what I read, over a number of weeks. And for a parent to sort of say, well, they're not really bad children, it's not a prank. And I think my view is that although the Secretary of State's been heavily criticised for this, I think she's very right to do that. And I think the headmaster has said they want that. But children really... the schools, I've got to say, on the island, the two or three schools I've been in have been delightful. And that's the sort of schools you want. You want children well behaved, you want them to be interested, but you want them to be in a very firm and disciplined environment where they're not going to hurt themselves or other children. And I think that I am saddened by that. I've written a children's novel that's coming out next year with the theme of bullying. Bullying is the worst thing in a school.
Is that about Miss Batty?
No.
The teacher was Batty?
No, that's my poems. Those are funny poems. This is
The Day Our Teacher Went Batty.
That's the funny poems, yes. But this one is about bullying, the novel, and it's about a boy who is. And I just think it undermines everything you do at school. It knocks your self-esteem, your confidence. And you must... Again, I was talking to people at the dinner, teachers there at the dinner yesterday, and they were quite firm about you must stamp it out, and that's quite right.
But then look at this business of actually downgrading marks, and that comes from the highest echelons of our education system.
Yes.
I mean, you before you went on to these higher ranks and became so popular overall, but you became the county education advisor.
Yes.
That wouldn't have gone on in your day, downgrading marks?
Well,
to suit a political angle?
Well, there's always been... I was an examiner for GCSE some years ago, and they've always had... like the 11 plus, when I was born in 1946, there was the bulge year, so you couldn't get the numbers going to the grammar school. So the chances of getting into grammar school in 1946 was much less than when the birth rate declined, because they had more places. And similarly with exams, they've always been the view that standards have declined. The government, I think, and anybody else is always worried about a public reaction. Well, of course, it's not as hard as it used to be, as rigorous. And I am appalled by it, of course. Appalled that, I mean, my daughter's in the middle of this. See, Lizzie, who was our fourth child, got A's in her papers, written papers, and an E in her assessed paper. Now,
well, what a difference.
Well, of course, it's usually the other way around. And the teachers at the school gave her an A for that. Now, experienced teachers. So I am in the middle of this, and I feel, and I think youngsters have been deprived at university places. It's appalling. It's quite appalling what's happened.
Of course, I just thought, really, that this countryside of yours, be it North or South Yorkshire, was Heriot country, wasn't it?
Oh, it was. And of course, I was very
Alf
flattered.
White.
Alf White was his name. And my editor was Heriot's editor. And
really?
Oh, yeah. And I've been compared, they say the James Heriot of schools, and people say, well, how do you sort of like feel being on the back of Heriot? But of course, I'm very, very flattered. I met Alf White, and he was a lovely man, gentle, quiet man. He wasn't a great speaker. He didn't, go do lots of talks, but my goodness, a lovely man. And his son, who I know, Jim White, again has written his biography of his father. It's a very good book. And Jim was telling the story, a lovely story, about his father going to a farm with... he said his father made most money as a vet with bovine diarrhea, and there was a little farmer at this farmhouse, and Heriot, Alf White, said, well, the way what you've got to do is you put this rubber tube up the back of your cow, and you put a pill in, and then you nip the end of the rubber tube, and you give it a very hefty blow. I'll show you what to do. So Heriot did this. He blew, and the pill went shooting up the back of the cow. He said, now you have a go. And the little farmer sort of put the pill in and lipped the end and blew it, but he didn't blow hard enough, and it was stuck halfway through. So he said, no, you've got to give it a really good blow. And he said there's a huge farmhand, a huge strapping farmhand standing watching, and he said to Heriot, the vet said, come over here a moment, will you please? He said, just give it a final blow, you see. And the man took the tube out of the cow and turned it round the other way. And then he blew the pill, and it went straight up. And the vet said, why did you do that? He said, why did you take it out and turn it around and do that? And he said, he says, I'm not having it in my mouth after it's been in his. The other lovely story, Harriet, that gave me was about which I've used, but he never used, was about visiting a farm and saying to the farmer, well, your little boy's 8 years old now. He's going to take over the farm one day, he said, and he ought to see the birth of the little calf. So the little boy was duly got out of bed, carried across the field to the byre in his dressing gown and slippers, and his father stood him on a little 2 bales of hay behind this wooden partition, and said to the little boy, now you just watch. And Harriet the vet brought in the Black Angus cow, and she struggled and finally gave birth to this amazing little creature, which was a Black Angus calf, black from head to foot, shimmering, and he held it up, and it was steaming, and the little boy's had eyes, as we say in Yorkshire, like chapel hat pegs, and he stared at this little creature, and the vet held it up really under his nose and said, and what do you think of that? Isn't that a little miracle? What do you think of that? And the little boy said, after a while, he said, well, how did it swallow the dog in the first place?
That's lovely.
So a lot of mine,
so innocent.
It is, and you see, my books are in the process of being televised.
You've sold the rights of the first 2.
Sold the rights, yeah. And the BBC are hoping to do it next year. They've got the writer. He's done the first episode, first 2 episodes. And
are they going to have a main character? Or
yes. I mean, they've got to pick somebody who's playing me, and I said to Leonardo, chance to be a fine thing. But that comes out.
But you're a performer yourself. You could be yourself.
I couldn't do myself. I'm 56 next, Geraldine. It's got to be a young man.
Ah.
and they're going to hopefully put it on BBC, which will be interesting,
Well, this latest book, actually, your latest bestseller, Head Over Heels in the Dales, that's really about your courtship days with your lovely wife,
yes,
Chris.
Yes, it is. Yeah. So he was with me in the Isle of Man for these few days. And she remembers, as I did, many fond memories of the island. And as I say, I told you last time, I came over as a little boy every summer for about 8 or 9 years.
Oh
with
yes,
the
this was
school.
to Russian primary school.
Yes, we used to take over Russian primary school during the summer for 2 weeks. It was £9 for 2 weeks in the Isle of Man, and they cleared all the desks out and put camp beds in, canvas camp beds with metal frames, and they were fabulous holidays. And I went to work in Russian primary school with the children, and I really thought I was going to have this wonderfully nostalgic trip, but it had all changed, of course. Wonderful new school, new buildings, sports hall, everything.
But a bit disappointing
But
for
the
you.
classroom was not at all the same. The exterior was. But I just remember walking out of Port Erin,
the conger eel.
and catching a conger eel, going up Bradder Head. So Chris came, but she went in a hotel when she was a little girl. You see, she went with her parents to little. She went in search of a little cafe called Smoky Joe's, which is, she remembers. It's now something. I think it's something rather posh now. Something, a bistro or something.
It's gone posh.
It's gone very posh now.
Yeah. Will you ever run out of material, do you think?
Yes, I will.
Especially as
Yes.
you're obviously no longer the school's inspector. I mean, you've risen to
Oh,
higher
I do,
things.
yes. I will. I still work 2 weeks in schools. I say when on the island this time, I was in Russian primary school. I went to St John's and had a super time, a great time. And you see, I'm still getting, even when you go there, I mean, I said to a little girl who was doing the Manx dancing, you know, she was holding her fingers in a very particular way, with the third finger pressed upon the thumb, like the horns of like an antler, as she was dancing, and very intricate dance. And I said, "What is the significance of holding your fingers in that position?" She said, "No, I just find it comfortable. That's all." So there might be a chapter on the Isle of Man next time.
Oh, good. Yes, you just stolen my next question. Actually, it's about time we had some publicity. I mean, publicity of your ilk would do the Isle of Man a lot of good.
I mean, I've just had such a marvellous time because I did a head teachers conference also in Douglas with the primary head teachers, and heads of English came along, and they were really very, very keen, positive. Joined with the advisor and the literacy consultant, and it was a good day. Really enjoyed the day with working with teachers, and then the festival, of course, and another lunch today for Pat Corrin at the ladies' luncheon. So that'll be good fun.
You are really sought after now, I suppose, Gervais, as an after-dinner speaker, really.
Yes, I mean my material. My material. I hope I've never had any complaints, but it is anecdotal. It's not telling jokes. It's not offensive. It's not.
It's based on the truth.
Yeah, and of course you would know that my stories are embroidered, and that I've got the kernel of a story, but it is embroidered. I mean,
You're painting with a broad brush.
That's right. I mean, a little girl who in a school who was doing a numeracy worksheet, you see, and the gobbledygook, the language of education changes, and it's no longer maths, it's numeracy, or English, it's literacy. And this little girl, very wise little thing, and I said, what are you doing? She said, "I'm doing a numeracy worksheet." And then when the teacher had gone, she said, "It's really sums." And then I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "Well, I do that." And she drew a little shape and do triangle. And then I do that and I put circle. And I do that and put square. And I said, "Well, what's number 4 then, your answer there, Melanie?" She said, "Well, it said name this shape, so I thought I'd call it Melanie." Now, isn't that lovely? It's a really sweet little thing that they do. And children come out with that. Little phrases, little comments, little philosophers, really.
See, most of your stories are told with this distinctive accent.
Yeah.
But that isn't to say that you can't do other stories, because there's a lovely little one about a little girl in Oxford. She was angelic looking, I think, with, flaxen blonde hair and beautiful blue eyes.
Yes.
And she had an autograph book.
Did I tell that last time I came on, I think, was it?
You haven't told it on my programme.
I know that I did visit this school, and the teacher said, would I come in? And she came up to me. She was 6. And
it
she
was
said,
Oxford, was it?
It was Oxford. She came up and she said, "Are you famous?" And I said, "No." She said, "Mrs. Callahan said you were famous." I said, "Well, have you heard of me?" "No, I haven't actually." She said, "But I was told you were famous." I said, "Well, I can't really be famous if you haven't heard of me." She said, "No, you can't." Actually, she said, "But I brought my autograph book specially." And I said, "Well, I'll happily sign it, but I'm not famous." And she said, "Well, I really don't want you to sign it. If you're not famous." I said, "Well, I won't sign it then." She said, "My name is India, and I'm named after a country." And I said, "Well, my name is Gervais, and I'm named after a yoghurt. And she said, no, you're not named after a yoghurt. She said, they don't name people after yoghurts. I said, India, look at me. And her little face looked at me. I kept a very straight face. When my mother was expecting me, she had a passion for French yoghurt and broccoli. I said, I think I did pretty well with the Gervais. And she giggled and said, you're very much like my grandpa, you know, Mr. Phinn. She said, he's just what, you know what you are? I said, no, what am I? You're a tease. I said, do you like to be teased, India? She said, well, I do rather, because it's fun, isn't it? She said, my grandpa's a terrible tease. He takes me places, and he's so terribly funny. And this little face looking at me said, Mr. Phinn, she said, do you know Sir Peter Dickinson? I said, no. She said, well, he was in charge of the Royal Observatory, you know. He looked after the stars. He's my grandpa. I said, right. And do you know Lady Cusack? I said, no. She said, well, she used to do ballet, and she's very famous, and she's my granny. And do you know, she said, Lord Renwick in the House of Lords? I said, no. She said, he's my other grandpa. And she went through all these lists, and I said, you hold it there a moment, India. I said, I'll get my autograph book.
That's absolutely marvellous. Then there's a very quick, short little one, because the clock is going to beat us, unfortunately. But I think it was to do with the Mayor of Rotherham or something, and there was a procession.
Oh, we were going to the Nativity, and we were going down the path to the Nativity. All the children were coming the opposite way. And the Mayor of Rotherham stopped this little boy and said, where's everybody going? He said, we've come for the Nativity, the VIPs here. This little lad said, it's off. He said, it's off. He said, Virgin Mary's got nits.
That's certainly telling. Have you ever gone into a school, as the inspector, and obviously had to sort of talk to the children and so on, and actually not succeeded with them? I can't imagine it, but got a rapport back.
Oh yes. I mean, one little boy, I went in and I said to him, what have you written? He said, I went home and was really knackered. And I said, well, no, I said, not a nice word for a little boy to use, that, knackered. Change it. You should change it to that. And he changed it to buggered. He said, I went home and felt buggered. And I said, well, no, I said, that's not. I said, what? He said, well, you're really good on words, you aren't you? He says, on what other words are better? And he really tackled me. I said, well, you should put word like tired, I think. He said, it's not as good as buggered, though. And he really did argue with me. So sometimes, you get children who can be quite difficult and indeed repellent. And secondary school children have told me have used two words sometimes, which is something of a shock.
And then there was the word sex.
The little girl who said to me, it begins my third book now, and she said, could you tell me how to spell sex? She said, only six, and I said, why do you want that word? She said, well, it's for my story. And I said, well, what is your story about? She said, well, it's about a little beetle that is lonely and lives on a compost heap, and he falls in love with another lady beetle, and they fall in love and they have lots of babies. And I said, right. And she said, I would like you to, well, could you spell sex then for me? I said, well, I think probably a better word might be snuggle up or cuddle. I don't think that's... She said, and she said in a really loud voice to the girl, she said, I don't want snuggle up and cuddle. She said, I want sex. Really loud voice. The teacher came and said, whatever is it? Mr. Phinn won't spell sex for me, miss. And the teacher, and then she had to go through all the rigmarole of this beetle on the compost heap. And she said, well, I think probably snuggle. She said, Mr. Phinn said that, but I don't want that. Miss, I can do the in part, but I can't do the sex. And she began a story, in sex.
That is absolutely tremendous. Well, it has been all our good fortune here on the Isle of Man to have had such a spectacular guest. Those who were fortunate enough to meet him on his travels around the island have had a bonus. And we certainly have today on the Geraldine Jamieson interview. Gervais Phinn, I hope it won't be very long at all before we can persuade you and your lovely wife, Chris, to come back to the Isle of Man.
Well, I'd love to.
Perhaps I could ask you to go out with what you used actually at the festival luncheon, the Irish Blessing.
Yes, of course. The prayer that my mother used to say, may the road rise up to meet you and the sun shine warm upon your face. May the winds be ever at your back and the rains fall soft upon your fields. May all of us be in heaven half an hour before the devil finds out. And until we meet again, may God hold you all in the hollow of his hands.